Um, we've been looking at figures in the history of Christianity who have forever impacted the course of Christian history. And until tonight, we've been looking mainly so far at biblical figures. So, of course, Jesus himself is the foundation of Christianity. We wouldn't have Christianity without Christ. Paul left a permanent impact in terms of the expansion of Christianity beyond the Jewish world. So, had we not had the great work of Paul the Apostle, the expansion of Christianity into the Gentile world probably would not have been in the same way that it happened. So, and of course we looked at Peter the Apostle, the lasting impact of having a bishop of Rome, the Petrine ministry, and the life of the church. And we've also looked at the figure of Mary, and though her human life was hidden mostly in shadows in the first century, the Marian dimension of the church actually has grown through the centuries. And in Catholicism in particular, and in Eastern Christianity, the role of Mary has been very important, particularly in the last several centuries in Roman Catholicism. So there are lots of figures in the 20 centuries of Christian history who have had major impacts. We can't talk about all of them. I mentioned last time we're not going to be talking about the essential role of the evangelists, for example, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Although all of them are important and, of course, left a lasting impact on Christianity. But tonight we are moving beyond the biblical period of time, and we're going to be looking at the Emperor Constantine, sometimes called the first Christian emperor. Some historical scholars like to debate that question. However, I think in the Western tradition, calling him the first Christian emperor makes a certain amount of sense. And certainly, the fact that Constantine was involved in the Christian church in the way that he was, and his leadership as the Roman emperor has left a permanent impact on Christianity for the last 1600 years or 1700 years. So in some ways, some could argue, and have probably argued, that the impact of Constantine and what he chose to do is so significant that there's probably been no change in the history of Christianity before or after that has had such a lasting impact. And I think that there would be good arguments to make for that side of the story. So I want to talk a bit about what preceded the Emperor Constantine, his unique role in Christianity at that decisive period in the history of the church, and why I think he is one of those key individuals who has left a lasting impact on the history of Christianity. I've kind of subtitled the Constantinian turning point, Cultural Christianity. And by that, I mean that Christianity and culture, civilization, the empire, the medieval period and beyond, became intertwined in a way because of Constantine that had not happened before his leadership as the emperor. And in some ways, the impacts of what Constantine chose to do remain with us to this very day. So that lasting impact of the Emperor Constantine, I think, is hard to overstate. So we'll talk a bit about that. Born somewhere around 288, and he died in around 337 AD. He became the emperor in 306, and was emperor until his death in 337. So a little bit about what preceded the Emperor Constantine in terms of the relationship of Christianity to the Roman Empire. For a moment, though, I want you to think about the fact that the people, God's people of Israel, the Jewish people, had created their own space in what we call today the Holy Land, most of us Christians. But you have to remember that when the Greeks invaded the Holy Land in the 4th century, that they carried with them the Greek culture into the Holy Land, the Greek language. They They also carried all kinds of Greek influences, but the spread of Greek civilization and then the Roman Empire invading in around 64 BC, those invasions of the Holy Land mean not only that you get Roman civilization brought to the Holy Land, the Roman roads, the system of governance, the military of Rome was present, but you still had a Greek cultural milieu. Thus, the entire New Testament is written almost exclusively in the Greek language. So translated for us, of course, into English, and there are Aramaic words that remain remnants in the New Testament, but most of it is in Greek. But the other side of that coin is that because the Greeks spread civilization throughout the Mediterranean area, both in North Africa and also from Rome around through Greece and so forth, and the Romans developed such a good road system of transportation and communication that Jewish people also spread throughout the Roman Empire. So there was a diaspora. So Jewish synagogues existed in the city of Rome in the first century and throughout much of the empire. So this means that when Paul began preaching the gospel, he could travel quickly throughout the Roman Empire because of the good road system, good transportation and communication. And there were also pre-existing Jewish synagogues that Paul could go to. And if you read carefully, by the way, the Acts of the Apostles and Paul's letters, what you often find is that there might be some Jews who readily accepted the gospel, but there were others that were happy to throw Paul out of the synagogue. So Paul quickly turned to what are called the God-fearers, people who believed in the God of Israel and the Jewish faith, but had never formally become Jewish, and also a circle of people, the Gentiles, that were sort of in the area. So Christianity quickly became something that happened in the Roman Empire in what you would call the urban areas. So Christianity spread quickly in the cities, especially among the lower classes. So the greatest resistance to Christianity in the Roman Empire happened in two areas. So one area that the resistance was very strong was in the rural countryside. So you all probably can get a sense that people who live in the country tend to want to hold on to the old ways. So they had their pre-existing religion of the Roman gods and so forth. And the people in the countryside, simpler and disconnected from urban life in the urban centers, often held on to, with great fervor, the traditional Roman religion and resisted the Christian influence. So that by the time of Constantine, less than 10% of the population of the Roman Empire was Christian. So the other area of major resistance to Christianity, not surprisingly, happened in the aristocracy. So those Roman citizens who were very high up in the Senate and governance, they had political reasons to hold on to the old system, and they didn't want to let go of it. And so there was a lot of resistance at those highest levels. So Christianity is typically becoming quickly what you might call an urban phenomenon among the poorer folks. So that's how Christianity spread very rapidly throughout the empire. Sometimes I think that we have the picture that in the Roman Empire, that for the first 3 centuries, that if you were Christian, that every single moment of your life you were in peril. You know, that you could be killed at any time by the Roman authorities. That was not the case. So there were sporadic persecutions against Christians, but it was by no means empire-wide for those first 300 years, with a couple of serious exceptions, which we'll talk about in a minute. But there were significant moments when there was a certain danger. So remember that the Roman religious system was intertwined with the state. The emperor was a key part of that religious system, and to question the Roman gods was an iffy thing to do. So why did Christianity, why was it tolerated by the Roman Empire? Well, the Roman Empire had a great respect for ancient religions, and they had a great respect, for example, for Judaism because it was so ancient. And so they permitted the Jews to exist in the empire, not only because of their antiquity, but also Jews were not extremely evangelistic, we would say, as Christians, or they didn't proselytize a lot. Christianity at first was sort of viewed as a variant of Judaism. So the Romans sort of let the Christians, it was sort of a bit under the radar. The first kind of outbreak against Christians actually happened under Roman authorities in the city of Rome itself. There had been a fire under the Emperor Nero at that time. People were dissatisfied with his leadership, and he did what good political leaders do. He blamed somebody, and in this case, he blamed the Christian minority. And so in 64 AD, the Emperor Nero begins a persecution of Christians, and among the martyrs were Peter and Paul the apostles. So Rome becomes known as the apostolic see, the place where Peter and Paul were, because of their, not only their presence there preaching the gospel, but also because of their martyrdom there. So that will become very significant, as you all know, in Christian history. So people still travel to Rome because of the presence of the apostles. Preeminently, we Catholics today, it's probably because of Peter, but also Paul. So we should never forget that both Peter and Paul were regarded with great reverence in early Christianity. And the fact that both had been martyred there was significant. So that would be the first outbreak of persecution on the part of Roman authorities against the Christian community. So Christianity at that point had been developing for about 30 years. So nonetheless, Christians were aware that the Jewish majority had introduced a curse known as a blessing into their worship. And so there was some persecution on the part of Jews. And so there was always a bit of an unease. Christians were definitely a minority in a much greater culture. And because of that, Christianity often protected itself. So when Christians met, they often met in secret in homes to celebrate Eucharist. And if you were not yet baptized, not yet a believer, you were not welcome to be part of the Eucharistic celebration. So if someone wanted to become a Christian, they needed someone who was already a Christian to be their sponsor and to attest that they had been found ready to become a Christian and would thus be safe to bring to the Christian assembly. And in the early church, you know that the period of what we call today the catechumenate became sort of an extended period of time. And part of that was so that they could learn about the Christian moral way of life, but also be tested to make sure that they were in fact genuine in their commitment to following Christ and the gospel. So once they were baptized, they were permitted to enter into the place of Christian worship. So this protective kind of secrecy of the Christian community, it was an awareness that the Christians had that they needed to nurture themselves as a minority in the great empire. And that will become later on a problem on the part of Roman authorities. You know, typically larger cultures don't like secret groups within them they don't know about. So that will become one of the issues that comes up. But it's safe to say that for most of the imperial period before Constantine, that you didn't have widespread empire-wide persecutions. So one of the things that did happen, though, is that, and this is probably the first attempt across the empire, the emperor Septimius Severus issued an edict. He was the emperor from 193 to 211. So talking about almost 100 years before Constantine. He issued the first kind of empire-wide edict with some degree of persecution of Christians. Some of the Roman governors who had responsibility for different provinces objected to that treatment of Christians. So it was met with some degree of resistance. But it's also important to note that in the 200s, the empire was coming under increasing strain of various sorts. And what do I mean by increasing strain? You had major migrations of Germanic tribes that we call barbarians, right, by the Roman Empire, So huge movements of population into the empire. Rome was trying to defend itself militarily, politically, and culturally. And the stress of this onslaught of immense numbers of people moving to the empire became more and more difficult for Rome to manage. So taxes went up a lot. The army had to be strengthened. The difficulties of continuing to defend the borders. So high degrees of what you would call social strain in the empire. So the system itself, the population was under a lot of duress. What happens when a culture experiences high degrees of stress of various sorts like that? Typically, they look for an enemy. And so who got blamed? The Christians, because they didn't worship the Roman gods. If we had kept the purity of the Roman culture in the empire, we would have been able to be protected against all these terrible things that are happening. So it's the Christians' fault for not believing in the gods that the Romans had worshipped. So the Christians began to get blamed. And under the Emperor Decius, the first major and very severe persecution against the Christian church broke out in the mid-250s. So Decius was the emperor from 245 to 251. And during this time, throughout the empire, in some places worse than others, there were severe persecutions at that point against Christians. What did that mean? It meant that if church properties had been built, they could be confiscated. It meant that if you did not worship the Roman gods, you could be imprisoned or worse. And so that period of persecution left a lasting impact on Christianity. After Decius, things lightened up a bit. So you had some tolerance of Christianity after that period, but once that happens, of course, it does leave a lasting mark. One of the big problems that brought, by the way, was that was the first empire-wide persecution that had such a serious impact. I mean, Christians were all the things that we think about, fed to the lions. They were placed on molten chairs to be burned. They had feet cut off. The sacred books were destroyed. I mean, all forms of torture that you can imagine were inflicted on the Christians of that era. Not surprisingly, therefore, what happened? Many who were Christians denied their faith, they became apostates, and they worshipped the Roman gods, or got a certificate indicating that they had worshipped the Roman gods. So this created a problem in the Christian community. If you have denied your faith in Christ, what do you do now? And the Christian church leadership became split. There were those who had remained faithful. There were bishops who were martyred. There were priests who were martyred. There were many faithful who were martyred and stood up to the Romans. So the problem was some remained faithful and suffered greatly. Others denied the faith. But after the period of persecution, they wanted to be readmitted to the Christian community. So the hardliners said no. They denied the faith. Once they've denied the faith, once they become apostates, they can't come back into the church. It was one of the bishops of Rome, actually, who argued for leniency. So he said, allow them to go through what we call today the order of penitence and to be reconciled to the church so that they can be restored to the practice of the faith. So that was a great controversy that happened in the 3rd century. Another terrible period of persecution happened under Diocletian, so he's probably the last great persecutor of the Christian community. He was the emperor from 303 to 312. And during that time, Diocletian took the persecutions of Decius to a whole new level. And he recognized that you had to aim for the leaders of the Christian community. So they were subject to the most harshest of tortures. And also things like the books of the Gospels would be destroyed or burned. So sacred objects collected, any church buildings that had been built would be torn down or confiscated. So that was a period of unparalleled suffering of the Christian community. So that background, by the way, is very important for us to remember, because until that point in time, there was always a certain degree of peril about being Christian in the Roman Empire. And remember too that you're still a minority. Christianity had no control over the major cultural currents of the Roman Empire, but it existed in sort of a living way within the empire at that point. So what happened? So we're going to look at the great figure of Constantine tonight. That's why I speak about a Constantinian turning point in the history of Christianity. So he was born of the Emperor Constantius and the mother Helena, who was a Christian. And he was acclaimed emperor, by the way, at the death of his father in what today is the city of York in England. He was with his troops in York, fighting in the northern realms of the empire, when word of the death of his father arrived to the troops, and they acclaimed him as the new emperor. So by 312, he had actually taken the city of Rome itself. There was another rival, a brother-in-law, Maxentius, who also had claimed the throne, and so the two of them had to fight it out first. So I mentioned here Christianity and the empire before 313. It was an episode that happens at the Milvian Bridge in 312, which is very significant for Christian writers. So Lactantius, a Christian writer, and Eusebius, the early church historian, both speak about what took place surrounding the battle that took place there. So that was the decisive battle between the Emperor Constantine and his rival emperor, the Emperor Maxentius, who will rule the Roman Empire. So the story of Lactantius is, and he would be preserving a simpler form of the story, that Constantine had some form of encounter with the Christian God, with Jesus, the night before the battle, and saw the symbol of what we call the Chi-Rho, which is over here on the right, which represents the person of Christ, and was told to place that symbol on the shields of his soldiers. And indeed, later on, Constantine will have the Chi-Rho, which is a Christian symbol, placed on the shields of his soldiers. Eusebius, the church historian, later writes in a more dramatic way and says that Constantine told him the story that Constantine and even his troops saw the sign of the cross in the sky. And the phrase, "in this you will conquer," was associated with the sign of the cross in the sky. So Constantine himself seems to have told Eusebius that that was a decisive turning point in his own life. Now scholars debate, with Constantine, did he have a full Christian conversion at that moment near the Milvian Bridge? Some say no, it was not what we would understand as a full Christian conversion, but clearly something decisive happened, and he saw that the Christian God would be the one who would lead him victorious in battle at that point. So I think it's fair to say that, and Constantine before that period, the Romans had a lot of gods, but Constantine preferred the worship of the sun god. So it was easy to make the jump from worshiping one sun god to worshiping Christ, the Son of God, because Christian authors would employ lots of imagery about Jesus he is the true light of the world. He is the sun that shines upon us. So it was easy for Constantine to make the move from his pre-existing belief and worship of the sun god to worshiping the one we would call the Son of God. So the decisive thing that happened though the next day was, inexplicably, Maxentius shouldn't have done it, and a good military leader probably would not have done it at that point. He left the protection of the walls of the city and came out with his troops and was decisively defeated. So Constantine associated that victory with the Christian God. And so, assuming the role of the emperor, Constantine will, from that point forward, move more and more in the direction of protecting and supporting and nourishing, in fact, Christianity. So that's a significant and decisive turning point. 313, so he becomes the emperor in 312 in the city of Rome. In 313, he met with the Eastern emperor. So at that point, remember, there were co-emperors, one in the east, one in the west. He met with Licinius in the city of Milan. And so in the city of Milan, he and his co-emperor sat down to work out a lot of practical legislative kinds of things. One of the things that Constantine emphasized at that point was the importance of granting toleration to Christians throughout the empire. He wanted Christians to be tolerated and protected throughout the western and the eastern parts of the empire. So this is later known as the Edict of Milan in 313, or the Edict of Constantine, or the Edict of Toleration. So this did not, by the way, as some people falsely think, this did not make Christianity the legal religion of the Roman Empire. It doesn't become the official religion until Theodosius, later in the century. However, it does provide protection for the Christians throughout the empire by a form of letter sent out to all the governors of the empire. The other thing it did was it mandated that any properties of the church that had been confiscated in the persecutions, that those properties be returned to the Christians. So this was a significant development. It's more than simply, we're going to let the Christians live in peace. It's, if you've taken their property, you're going to give it back to them now. So that's precisely what happened. Licinius, by the way, tried later on to renege on that commitment, and Constantine eventually did battle against Licinius, and in 324 defeated him in the east. So then Constantine becomes the sole emperor of the entire empire in 324. So one of the things that we often think about is when you accept the gospel, you become a Christian, one of the first things that happens when you read the New Testament is what happens? You're baptized. Constantine was not baptized at that point in his life. In fact, he was not baptized until his final illness on the deathbed. So why was that? Well, in the 4th century, many Christians, in fact, delayed baptism till the end of life. Why was that? Well, baptism was known to forgive all of your sins. So if you were baptized, your sins would be forgiven. If after you were baptized, you sinned in a very grave or serious kind of way, to be reconciled to the church was extraordinarily difficult, if not at times impossible. So the order of penitence was extremely rigid, very harsh, and so by that point you did not want to fail in a grave way. So some Christians simply waited then to be baptized until they were past what they thought was the danger of sinning in some kind of a grave way. So that is probably one of the reasons that Constantine did not elect to be baptized until the end of his life. The other reason, he did express his hope that he would be able to travel to the Holy Land and actually be baptized in the Jordan River. So part of it might have been his desire to wait for that significant moment and location to be baptized. I don't believe Constantine ever was able to realize his desire to go to the Holy Land, but his mother Helen was able to do so. So this moment in the history of Christianity, 313, I often say, if you have to pick the 5 most important dates in the history of Christianity, almost any list should include 313 for that reason. So never again after this point will Christianity be subject to the same kinds of persecution that it experienced before 313. Now I say that with one tiny exception, because after the period of Constantine, there was one emperor, Julian, who grew up and secretly loved the old Roman gods. And when he became the emperor, he tried to restore the pagan Roman gods as the official religion of Rome, and to venerate the cult of the Roman gods. and so he's called by Christians Julian the Apostate because he was baptized as a child, but he never really accepted it. So as he grew older, he was intolerant of Christians, but it was nothing like it was before Constantine. So they were never able to reestablish that same level of persecution that took place under Decius and Diocletian. And then after the death of Julian, you get the Emperor Theodosius, who will in fact make Christianity the official religion of the empire. So that is very, very significant. So what Constantine began that process later in the century, Theodosius is the one who officially makes it the official religion of the Roman Empire. All right, why do I think this is so significant in the history of Christianity? Well, if you think about being a Christian before Constantine, your choice to follow Christ up till that point always entailed a certain degree of marginalization. So you were a minority in a culture that was predominantly not Christian, and there were certain dangers that could happen depending upon where in the empire you lived and at what point. So to become a Christian at that point before Constantine always involved a certain cost. You were always countercultural. The larger culture was always against that main movement of Christianity. So it always required what I would call a certain level of sacrifice. Once Constantine makes Christianity legal in the empire, it is no longer the costly thing that it once was. In fact, as the 300s unfold, Christianity will grow quickly from 10% of the population, and by the end of the century, it will be the majority. So once Christianity becomes the majority, once it controls all the cultural institutions of governance, you're in an extremely different place than you were before Constantine. In fact, you're a minority that is subject to persecution if you're not Christian. So what does that mean for Christianity? I think it will fundamentally change the character of Christianity from a religion that demands a high degree of sacrifice and of being persecuted in a sense, in a broad sense of that term. And now, if you're not one of the Christians, you're the unpopular crowd. So to become Christian at that point becomes an expectance of the culture and society that you live in. So you have to work to be non-Christian at that point. So that means that your decision to become a Christian might quickly become a cultural decision to fit in, rather than simply your core convictions about the faith. So we might say that might be considered, on one hand, a certain negative, right? It could dilute a bit the purity of what it means to follow Christ. And in fact, that often happened. So superficially, people would become Christian, but they did not necessarily accept the rigorous moral demands of being a Christian and all that entailed. So it's a new time in the Christian story. But there's also a very bright, wonderful part about it. What's the bright, wonderful part? Now that the empire is supporting the Christian religion, it begins to flourish publicly. So what did Constantine do? He did several significant things. Let's talk about, for a moment, I want to say a few words about Constantine himself was a bit in process as the emperor. So even after the Edict of Milan, Constantine had a period of time where the Roman coins still had images that were not Christian in orientation, and he certainly still allowed some of the symbolism of the pagan gods to continue in the Roman cultural milieu in Rome. So he didn't necessarily immediately remove all those things. He just began more and more to favor the worship of the Christian gods. So you see a movement in that direction. As some would say, his understanding of Christianity is still a little bit blended with the idea of the worship of the sun god. Even Pope Leo the Great, a century later, will chastise Christians who are coming for the Christmas Mass to St. Peter's, because before they go in for the worship at the Eucharist, they will bow to the sun in a sign of reverence before they go in and be part of the liturgy. So Leo said, that's a pagan practice. You shouldn't be bowing anymore to the sun. Christ is the true Son of God. So even, over a century later, you still have some remnants of that in Christianity. So we shouldn't be surprised that Constantine doesn't have this dramatic, like Paul did, conversion from one total disbelief into the Christian God to a total belief in Christianity. So there's certainly a process that's involved. I will say, though, that at his baptism, he took off his royal purple robes and clothed himself in the white robes of a catechumen. He put on Christ before he died. So that which he had spent so much of his leadership encouraging and developing, he certainly by the end of his life embraced fully. So I think in that sense it's fine to say he was the first Christian emperor. So I was going to talk about some of the wonderful things that he did. Churches. So for the first time in the Roman Empire, major churches could be constructed publicly with the support of the imperial finances, the treasury. What did Constantine do? He had basilicas built over the tomb of St. Peter the Apostle in Rome. He also had a basilica built over the tomb of St. Paul outside the walls. Now, there are still basilicas of St. Peter and Paul in Rome. They're not the ones Constantine had built. They've since been replaced. But he was the beginner of those big basilicas in those locations. He also had a basilica built in Jerusalem at the site of the Holy Sepulchre, the tomb of Jesus, called the Church of the Anastasis of the Resurrection, and one built in Bethlehem at the birthplace of Jesus. And when he renamed the eastern capital Constantinople and moved there as the emperor, he also built two major basilicas in the city of Constantinople, one of them after peace and the other after the apostles. And when he died, he was actually buried in the Basilica of the Apostles in Constantinople. So you have major building projects. The other thing he did was he donated the Lateran Palace to the bishops of Rome. So until the 1300s, that was actually the residences of the bishops of Rome. So again, we have the Lateran Basilica today in the city of Rome. You've got St. Peter, St. Paul, and the fourth major basilica, St. Mary Major. And so Constantine is really the originator of this great, massive imperial support for the building of great Christian structures. His mother, Helen, by the way, had a dream to go to the Holy Land, and she was able to go there and tour the holy sites. And as you all know, that Helen is probably most famously known for discovering the true cross of Christ and bringing parts of the cross back to Rome. So there are relics of the Holy Cross now in different locations in Europe as a result of Helen's pilgrimage to the Holy Land. So Constantine also wanted to go, as I mentioned, but he had problems with Christianity in the East. I'm going to talk about that in a minute with the Arians. And so he couldn't go until he resolved that problem, and that took more time and energy than he thought it was going to take, so he never got a chance to go himself. So the other big thing about Constantine was he began to change Roman laws in a way that would favor Christianity. I'll give you some examples. He outlawed, for the first time in the Roman Empire, the practice of crucifixion. Secondly, he had laws that would protect slaves and allow Christians to set slaves free. He passed laws to protect children from abuse. He instituted a huge program of charitable relief for the poor and the homeless, anybody who was suffering, and he funneled those funds through the Christian churches. So he supported charitable endeavors in a huge way. So Christianity will quickly be building things like hospitals and orphanages and refuges for women and widows and so forth. So every form of needy person could be cared for by the Christian community, and Constantine was ardent in his support of that. He also forbade the practice, which they had had before that time, of branding the faces of prisoners. So he used to brand their faces. And he said, man is created in the image of God, so you must not brand the face of a man. So things like that. There was Constantine, by the way, who set Sunday aside as an official day of rest on a holiday in the Roman Empire, the first time in Christian history that Christians actually had Sundays as a day free from work. They had worshipped always on the first day of the week, but Constantine now made it an official Roman holiday each week. So the Roman week gets structured because of that to some degree. So the laws that Constantine will enact are very significant. The other thing that Constantine did was he exempted the Christian clergy from certain taxes. So they had certain rights in the empire that other citizens didn't have. One could also say that this might be the beginnings of what you might call clericalism, of clerics being in a protected class of people, and that's why I say that what Constantine did will have lasting impacts to this very day, because there has still been, as you all could probably watch the news, this worldwide question about how clerics are treated in civil law. Are they seen as a quote-unquote protected class with special rights and also therefore obligations and duties? So later in the empire, clerics would not be judged by secular courts, but only by ecclesiastical courts. So those developments in Western civilization had their origin in Constantine setting aside clerics as sort of a protected class in terms of certain taxes. So it's hard to underestimate how significant that was. The other key thing that happened, which I forgot to put it as a Roman numeral, but many of you all know it, is that Constantine began to become very involved in what we might call the internal life of the church. So the Donatists had disagreements with the greater church, I think primarily over the readmission of apostates. They appealed to the emperor to become involved, which he did, and ruled against them, and they resisted his rule. And in fact, they said the Donatists lived on for another 3 centuries. They were persecuted for a while, but they actually didn't get eliminated in North Africa until the Muslim movement eliminated Christianity through much of North Africa. So with that, also Donatists disappeared, but they lasted for about 3 centuries. The other big controversy that you all know about in the early Christian church happened in Alexandria in Egypt, and this is the question of Arianism. So there was a priest by the name of Arius who taught that Jesus was greater than we human beings, but not fully God. And his bishop said, you're wrong. Jesus was God, from God, light from light, true God from true God. I'm using later language now. But essentially affirmed the divinity of Jesus. This created a division among the bishops in the eastern part of the empire. This happens after the Edict of Milan, and Constantine becomes aware that this is going on. He wants to go to the Holy Land, but there are these bitter animosities in the Eastern Empire between bishops and priests over the question of the identity of Jesus. So what does Constantine decide to do? He tries to get the bishops to work things out, to come to an agreement. And at first, he's sort of fuzzy on the details of what it involves. Eventually, though, he realizes he wants an empire with fundamental unity, and part of that unity has to come with a Christian community being together. So he did something unprecedented. In the year 325, he convened what we now call the First Worldwide or Ecumenical Council of the Catholic Church. So there have been local gatherings of bishops, synods of bishops, but never on a scale that size. So over 200 bishops from throughout the eastern part of the empire and a handful from the west gathered in the city of Nicaea precisely to debate the question of the identity of Jesus. And it was the Emperor Constantine who convoked that council and also presided over the council. And it was in fact Constantine, probably given the term by one of his theological advisors, who said we should use the term homoousios in Greek, that Jesus is of the same substance or the same being as the Father. And that, we all know that language gets incorporated later into the creed. So that Constantine was involved in that. All the bishops who were present agreed with the formula of Nicaea, except for two of them, and they were probably not so angry about the formula, but their churches were placed under the authority of a larger see, and they didn't like that. So Constantine played a key role in creating what we call the First Ecumenical Council. So you know that the 21st Ecumenical Council, the last one in the 1960s, the Second Vatican Council, had thousands of bishops. That probably wouldn't have happened had Constantine not originated the whole idea of gathering bishops in a worldwide council to resolve problems. Christian community and its leadership were, for the most part, somewhat happy to have this newfound attention of the Roman Emperor and his support. There were some, though, who said, you know, what does the emperor have to do with Christianity? So there were some questions raised, but in fact, overall, at the time, it was seen as a positive thing that happened in the history of Christianity. So that's a bit about the significant impact of Constantine. So questions or observations?
Who was the Pope during Constantine?
I don't know who the popes were, but he was emperor for a long time, 306 to 337. I would have to look that up, and I don't know off the top of my head.
Was he ever canonized?
Oh, question about whether Constantine was canonized. I do not believe that we Roman Catholics include Constantine in the official list of saints, in the canon of saints, but I could be wrong about that. But the Eastern churches definitely regard him as a saint. And so they do a feast day for him and also for St. Helen.
What about the term Catholic or Catholicism? When did that come into play?
All right, so the word, so Catholic was used centuries earlier. So when they talked about the Catholic Church, they meant the universal church of all Christians, or the greater church, the Orthodox, the right worshiping church, as opposed to smaller sects or individual bodies. So that had been used for some time of the Christian church. And
my parish church in Glasgow was St. Constantine's, and my grade school was St. Constantine's.
and where was that in?
Glasgow, Scotland.
Glasgow, Scotland.
Yeah.
And that was a Roman Catholic church.
Roman Catholic, as far as I know, it
So,
still is.
yeah, so I need to do an investigation and find out. We don't have on the current calendar of saints a feast day for Constantine, but it may be listed in the Roman canon. I need to explore that.
Where, the Lions and the Christians, where does that come into history? Is that
So-
before?
Constantine, so in fact, during the periods of persecution, Christians were in fact fed to the beasts.
Like what, do you know?
The Emperor Decius, Diocletian, mid-200s.
What
Yeah,
hundreds?
the Colosseum in the 200s.
200s, okay.
Yeah, you
Thank
definitely have Christians fed to the beasts. The Romans devised a lot of, in the ancient world, a lot of ways of torturing people, which they applied to Christians freely.
I was trying to see if I should say this. Some recent thing that I saw said that they actually hung Christians on posts and used them as lanterns.
Yes, that's right.
I thought that was unbelievably cruel.
Yeah.
But they did it.
Yeah, sometimes we're horrified by what humans do to humans in the modern world, But there's nothing that people are doing today, even beheadings, that weren't practiced in the ancient world. In that sense, I believe Constantine, because of the influence of Christianity, was a humanizing influence on the empire, and Christianity will become so.
Another question, comment. I'd heard that, yes, Constantine eventually became a Christian and a Catholic, but at the time that he started doing this, it was a great way to control people. In other words, if you're really a good Catholic and really a good Christian, you're pretty easy to govern, because you're supposed to love your neighbor, you're not supposed to kill, you're not supposed to steal, and so it was kind of like pragmatic. Hey, I'm one of you guys, so everybody kind of says, oh, he's not persecuting us or nothing. Makes life easier, or the responsibility of an emperor easier. Comment on that?
I think that my own thought about that would be that is projecting back a more cynical attitude than Constantine himself would have had.
Okay.
Even if his faith wasn't exactly what we call pure, I wouldn't take that cynical approach. I don't believe that he used it simply for political reasons. I think there was an authentic experience that he had and a profound conviction. And one early writer will say that Maxentius was rumored to have used sorcery and have recourse to the gods, and Constantine feared that and had this devotion to the sun god and implored the Christian God for assistance in his battle. So if Constantine in his mind associated that victory with the intervention of the true God, then that would probably have left in him a lasting impact, which you see developing over time.
Father, I would almost say that was his true conversion.
Yeah, traditionally that moment is kind of seen as that decisive turning point in Constantine's life.
I think it's interesting how his mother influenced him. He was named after his father, it sounded like.
Often those names would come down from the fathers, yes.
And that,
Connections there.
but is there a connection between his father and Christianity?
I think his father was pagan, so I don't think he was a Christian.
There's a movie now that I just, well, I don't know how long it's been on, but it's about Paul, St. Paul, in his last days. And St. Luke is there talking to him, and he's beginning to write letters to the Romans. Is that true, or is that just a movie? But they do show in that movie where they were using the Christians as torches in the streets.
Right, I think that's from the time of the Emperor Nero in 64,
Yeah.
as part of the torture. The date, by the way, of Theodosius making Christianity the official religion of the empire is 380 AD, so from 313 to 380.
And when did the sign of the cross become common as a sign for Christians? Up until originally it was the fish.
Right.
Okay, so when
Yeah, I think it's
sign-
partly as a result of Constantine himself using the symbol of the cross and the Chi-Rho that the cross becomes the new standard of Christianity rather than the fish. And so remember too that until Constantine abolished crucifixion, that was still happening in the Roman Empire. So the sign of the cross had multiple meanings that would be connected with capital punishment more than with a particular figure, except for Christians who would have reverenced the cross. So the fact that it's in that sign that he saw the Christian God revealed, and that's significant. And thus the Chi-Rho gets put on the shields of his soldiers as a symbol and a standard.
Who are the prominent historians from that era that a lot of this information?
The most important one is Eusebius. So he's the classic church historian of early church history. So you can get a copy of his church history in English today. So he is one of the principal sources. The other Christian author, Lactantius, writes about the Milvian Bridge, that episode, in a simpler form. And Constantine, you know, supposedly talked to Eusebius many years later, so, you know, so you're always wondering how did things develop in his own mind through the years, too.
How do you spell his name?
Eusebius,
Yeah. Is it EU?
Eusebius.
And Father, how do you spell the bridge? I can't get the name of the bridge that you're talking
The name of the
about. How do you spell it? Yeah.
Eusebius?
The other
Bridge.
bridge.
Oh, it's the Milvian, Milvian, the Milvian Bridge. By the way, if you like reading about this sort of thing, it's a small classic work, but the Early Church by Henry Chadwick is probably one of the still standard, very readable English classics of the history of the early church. You know, if you're fairly intelligent and intellectual and like reading about history, it's in less than 300 pages, and it's probably in English, you know, a great little history of the early church. So you can't find one that's much better than that. He has a whole chapter on, what does he call it? His 8th chapter, Constantine and the Council of Nicaea. So, but that's a great little work. The other little work that is all 20 centuries of Christianity, that's a kind of a more recent book, and it's been revised some. Thomas Bokenkotter has written a concise history of the Catholic Church. That's also a really good one-volume history of the Church through all 20 centuries. So, but those are always good places to start.
Constantine did his work, if you will, as a part of the government of the kingdom of Roman Empire. Who were the lead clerics in the church at that time, and what was their role? Were they just subordinate totally to him?
All right, so who are the leading clerics? I will say this. The 4th century, the 300s, will see the rise of some of the greatest leaders of Christianity. So you have people who will be emerging in that century and later, like Jerome, Augustine, Leo. I mean, some of these are a little later, Benedict. So you're going to have a great movement of very profound Christian leaders that will be emerging once culture and Christianity get connected together. And I'll say more about them at the next gathering that we have. All right, we've met the end of our time limit, so my first attempt to do a non-biblical character tonight. So I hope it's tweaked your interest a bit in the history of Christianity and how even someone who is just a political leader can have a lasting stamp on Christianity. So it's almost impossible to think about the Middle Ages when Christianity and culture are so connected without Constantine laying that foundation. He really is, in some ways, the architect of the Middle Ages and the union of what we'll call later church and state. So, all right, let's close with the Lord's Prayer tonight. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. Spirit